Dinner was already on the table when I checked my phone for the fourth time. 7:14. My son had said 6:30. My daughter-in-law had confirmed it herself 2 days ago, standing in my kitchen eating my shortbread. "We'll be there, Mum. Wouldn't miss it." The roast had been resting for 40 minutes. The gravy had started to film over. I'd lit the candles at 6, the good ones, the beeswax ones I'd been saving since Christmas, and now 2 of them had burned down almost a full inch. I turned 72 that evening. October 15th. A Tuesday, which I know doesn't sound like much, but my husband always said birthdays were sacred no matter what day of the week they fell on. He'd been gone for 3 years, and this was the 3rd birthday I'd spent without him. I thought I'd gotten used to the quiet. I hadn't. I called my son at 7:20. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His voice on the recording still sounded like the boy he used to be before the promotions and the downtown condo and the life that seemed to have very little room in it for me. I didn't leave a message. I texted my daughter at 7:25. She was 3 hours away in Calgary, which I understood. I truly did. But she'd said she was coming. She'd said it twice. I watched the 2 blue check marks appear almost immediately, which meant she had read it. She didn't write back. At 7:45, I blew out the candles, not because I was making a statement. I just didn't want the wax to ruin the tablecloth, the white linen one that had been my mother's. I served myself a plate and sat down at the table alone, and I ate. I want to be honest about what that felt like, because I think if I dress it up, I'll lose the truth of it. It felt like being erased. Not dramatically, not like a scene from a movie. Just quietly, the way a pencil mark disappears under the side of your hand without you meaning to rub it out. I sat there with my roast beef and my roasted carrots and my glass of Pinot Noir, and I thought, nobody knows I'm here. Nobody is thinking about me right now. In this whole city, in this whole country, not one person I love is wondering how I'm doing tonight. My husband would have never let this happen, not because he controlled our children. He didn't, he was gentle that way, but because he cared about the rituals. The candles. The good dishes. The showing up. He understood that showing up was the whole thing. He died from a stroke on a Thursday morning in March. He'd gone out to the driveway to brush the snow off his car before work, and when I went to call him in for coffee, he was on the ground. 69 years old. We'd been married 41 years. After he died, I learned that our family had been held together partly by his warmth and partly by the structure of the house we shared. Sunday dinners, the standing phone calls on Wednesday evenings, the way he'd made occasions feel like occasions. Without him, things drifted. I told myself it was grief, that everyone needed time, that we'd find our way back to each other. I waited. I kept making the dinners. I kept calling on Wednesdays. I kept showing up. And I was still waiting on October 15th, sitting alone at my dining room table, eating birthday cake for one out of a white box from the bakery on Elgin Street because I hadn't been able to bring myself to bake my own cake. There are certain dignities a person has to preserve. My son called at 9:47. I was already in bed with my book, but I answered because I always answer. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, and his voice had that tone in it, the one that meant he was sorry but also a little bit impatient, the way you are when you're apologizing for something you've already mentally moved past. The Harrington thing ran long. You know how these evenings go. The Harrington thing. A networking dinner for the commercial real estate firm where he'd been working for 11 years, waiting for a partnership that kept getting deferred. I understood ambition. I'd had it myself. I'd been an occupational therapist for 32 years. I'd run a department. I'd supervised a team. I knew what it meant to want things. But I also knew that the Harrington dinner had been on his calendar for 6 weeks, and my birthday had been on the calendar for 72 years, and I was having trouble understanding how one had become more urgent than the other. "It's fine," I said, because I didn't have the energy for anything else. "We'll do dinner this weekend. Saturday maybe, or Sunday. Whatever works for you." "Sure." "You're not upset?" It wasn't really a question. It was the kind of thing people say when they want to be reassured. I'm tired, I said. We can talk tomorrow. I put the book down after I hung up. I wasn't reading it anyway. I was looking at the ceiling, at the water stain in the corner that had been there since the winter my husband had climbed onto the roof to fix a flashing issue himself instead of hiring someone, and I was doing the thing I tried very hard not to do, which was adding everything up. My son had missed my 68th birthday because of a conference in Vancouver. Fair enough. It was a work obligation. I'd told him I understood. He'd missed my 70th because he and his wife had already booked a trip to Portugal that they'd been planning for 2 years. I told him I understood that too. For my 71st he'd come, but he'd arrived an hour late and left before dessert because his wife had a headache. Now this. My daughter, and I want to be careful here. Because I love her. I love both of my children, and I'm not telling this story to condemn them. My daughter had been better for a while. She'd called regularly after her father died. She'd come home for the first Christmas. She'd made an effort. But somewhere in the past year and a half, the calls had become shorter and further apart, and the visits had become, we were thinking about coming, and then just not coming. She was busy, I knew that. She had a good job in Calgary, a man she'd been with for 3 years who I had met twice. A life that had found its own shape. I just hadn't realized how completely that shape had been drawn without me in it. I lay there until about midnight, and then I got up and washed the dishes. I put the leftover roast in the fridge. I folded the linen tablecloth and put it away. I blew out the 2 tea lights I'd forgotten on the sideboard. And then I went and sat in my husband's chair, the old leather recliner he'd had since before we were married, the one the kids had tried to get me to throw out 4 times, the one that still smelled faintly of the cedar soap he used, and I talked to him. I don't know if he could hear me. I don't know what I believe about that, but I told him what had happened, and I told him I was tired, and I told him I didn't know what to do next, and something about saying it out loud made it feel more manageable. Less like being erased and more like a problem that had a shape. I said, I can't keep doing this, love. I can't keep setting the table. My neighbor came by the next morning. She's in her late 60s, a retired school principal who moved in 3 houses down after her own husband passed, and we'd become the kind of friends who look out for each other, taking in packages, sharing soup when one of us is sick, walking together when the weather allows. She knocked on the back door around 9 with a container of her lemon loaf and took one look at my face and said, "Sit down and tell me." So I told her, all of it. She listened without interrupting, which is a skill not enough people have. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that I've thought about every day since. "The question isn't whether they love you," she said. "I think they do in their way. The question is whether the life you're building is built around waiting for them to show it." I had been a mother for 44 years. I had shaped my life around my children in ways that were invisible to me, until she said that. The house I was still living in, 4 bedrooms, a backyard, a dining room I bought because it seated 8, was a monument to a family that no longer gathered in it. The Wednesday calls, the holiday dinners, the birthdays, all of it premised on the idea that my job was still to hold the center, to keep the table set, to be there when they finally made time to come home. "What would you do," she asked, "if you stopped waiting?" I didn't have an answer, but I started thinking about one. I want to tell you about my granddaughter because she's the part of the story I haven't said enough about. She's my daughter's daughter from a relationship that ended badly before my granddaughter was 3 years old. She's 20 now, studying environmental science at the University of Ottawa. The kind of young woman who sends thank you notes by hand and calls just to talk, not because she wants anything. She'd called me the morning of my birthday, before any of this happened, just to sing happy birthday in the off-key way we'd made into our own tradition since she was 7. She'd also mailed me a card, an actual card with a stamp addressed in her careful handwriting, with a note inside that said she wished she could be there, that she was thinking of me, that she loved me. She was the only one who'd done any of that. After my neighbor left, I called her, Just to hear her voice, she picked up immediately, like she always did, and I could hear the sounds of her apartment in the background, the kettle, the news on low. "Gran," she said, "how was last night?" I told her. I hadn't planned to. I didn't want to put her in the middle of things. But she asked so directly and she listened so well that the whole thing came out. She was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then she said, "I'm so sorry, Gran, that shouldn't have happened." "It's not your fault," I said. "I know, but it still shouldn't have happened." We talked for a long time that morning. She asked me what I needed, not in the vague way people ask when they don't really want an answer, but specifically, what would help? What would make the next month feel okay? And I found, somewhat to my surprise, that I had answers. I needed to stop living like I was holding something in place. I needed to figure out what my life looked like if I built it for myself instead of for a family dinner that never happened. She said, "Then maybe it's time to do that." I am not a dramatic person. I want to be clear about that before I tell you what happened next, because I think the choices I made might sound drastic to some people, and I want you to understand that they came from a quiet place, not an angry one. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was just, for possibly the first time in my life, deciding what I actually wanted. The house had been on my mind for 2 years. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a backyard with a garden I'd planted with my husband, on a street in Kanata that had been perfect for raising children and was now, honestly, a bit large for one person. The property taxes were substantial. The maintenance was relentless. The furnace, the roof, the driveway that needed sealing every other year. I'd been telling myself I was keeping it for the family, for Christmas visits, for grandchildren who might come and stay in the summer. But my grandchildren didn't come in the summer, and the room I'd kept for my daughter was now a room where I stored boxes I didn't open. I called a real estate agent in November, a woman I'd known through my former workplace, straightforward and kind, who I trusted to tell me the truth about the market. She came and walked through the house and gave me a number that surprised me. The market in Ottawa had moved considerably in the years since we bought, and what we paid for in the late 90s was worth a great deal more now. I listed it in January. It sold in 11 days. I found an apartment, a proper one, not a compromise, in Westboro, 2 bedrooms, a balcony facing the parkway, hardwood floors, and good light. The kind of place I would have wanted if I'd been choosing for myself all along, rather than for a life that had ended 3 years ago. I signed the lease and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't even known was tight. I called my son to tell him the house was sold. He was quiet for a long moment. "Where are you going to go?" he asked. "I found a place in Westboro." "An apartment?" "Yes." "Mum," he sounded genuinely alarmed, which I found honestly a bit late. "That house has been in our family for 30 years. I grew up in that house." "I know," I said. "I was there." He didn't seem to know what to do with that. He said he needed to think, which was fair. He called back 2 days later to ask if I'd thought about what would happen when I was older, whether I'd considered the long-term picture, whether it was wise to make a major financial decision in the aftermath of losing Dad. His wife had opinions about it too, which she communicated through him, which had always been her way. They thought I was being impulsive. They thought grief had made me irrational. I told him that I had spent 3 years being very rational and very patient, and that I had thought about this carefully and that the decision was made. My daughter called from Calgary the same week. She was more emotional than I expected. She cried a little on the phone, saying she'd always thought she'd come back someday, that she thought the house would be there. "It's always been home," she said. "I know," I said. "I made it that way." She heard something in my voice. She said, "Mum, are you angry with me?" I thought about how to answer that. I wasn't angry, not exactly, but I also wasn't going to pretend that nothing had happened. "I was alone on my birthday," I said. "I made a roast and set the table and lit the candles and I ate by myself. And you read my text message and didn't write back." She was quiet. I'm not telling you that to make you feel terrible, I said. I'm telling you because I think you should know, and because I've decided that I'm not going to keep organizing my life around occasions that don't happen. We talked for a long time after that. It was a harder conversation than we'd had in years, and also, in its way, a more honest one. She cried. I didn't. She apologized genuinely, and I believed her. I believe she meant it, but I also knew that an apology and a change were two different things, and I'd spent enough of my life waiting. I met with my lawyer in February. She was a woman I'd been referred to by a colleague years ago, rigorous and precise. And I trusted her. I'd been thinking about my estate for a while. My husband and I had done basic planning years ago, but it was overdue for a revisit. I want to be careful about how I describe what I decided, because I've seen the way people react to these stories and I don't want to be misunderstood. I wasn't trying to punish my children, I wasn't building a trap for them to fall into or engineering a scene of regret. I was simply deciding clearly and deliberately what reflected my actual life. I left each of my children a meaningful portion of what I had. Not a token, not a symbol, a real inheritance. But I also established a scholarship through the University of Ottawa for students in environmental science in my husband's name, and I made my granddaughter the primary beneficiary of the portion I'd set aside for education and future support, with a letter explaining why, not as a condemnation of her mother, but as a recognition of who had shown up consistently over the years. I told my children about the scholarship. I told them about the changes I'd made. I told them in person, in March, when my son came to see the new apartment for the first time. My daughter wasn't there. She said she was going to try to come in the spring. I said that would be lovely. My son looked around the apartment for a long time without saying much. I'd made it comfortable, and mine, the good furniture, the art I actually liked, the books organized the way I wanted them, the linen tablecloth folded in a drawer that I took out now only when I wanted to. He stood at the balcony window for a while looking at the parkway, the river just visible through the trees. It's a good view, he said finally. I know, I said. I chose it. He turned to look at me and I saw something in his face that I hadn't seen in a long time. Not guilt, exactly, but a kind of recognition. Like he was seeing me as a person rather than a fixture. I didn't say anything. I let him have the moment. He stayed for dinner that evening. We ordered Lebanese food from the place on Richmond, and we ate at my small table with the window open, and he talked about work, about the partnership situation, about some of the things that had been weighing on him. I listened. That had always been my gift to him, and I gave it freely. But I also told him things about my own life, the morning walks by the river, the lecture series I'd started attending at Carleton, the choir I joined at the community center, which had embarrassed me terribly at first and which I now loved. You seem different, he said, near the end of the evening. I am, I said. He nodded slowly, and I could tell he was still working out what that meant, what it cost him, what it changed. I didn't try to help him with it. Some things a person has to figure out on their own. My granddaughter came for a weekend in April. She slept in the second bedroom, which I'd furnished with a proper bed and good pillows because I wanted her to have a place to land. We walked along the river for 2 mornings in a row. We cooked a big pot of my husband's soup recipe and ate it over 2 days. She told me about her thesis, about a boy she was cautiously hopeful about the way the city felt like it was finally starting to feel like hers. On her last morning, sitting at the kitchen table with our coffee, she asked me how I was doing, really doing. I think I'm finding out who I am without the architecture of everyone else's needs, I said. She thought about that. That sounds like it took a long time. 72 years, I said, give or take. She laughed, and it was the best sound I'd heard in a long time, completely unguarded, the laugh she'd had since she was small. I made her promise to come back in the summer, and she said she would, and I believed her because she was the one person in my life who said things and meant them. I turned 73 in October. My neighbor came over and we opened a good bottle of wine and ordered pizza and watched a movie I'd been wanting to see for months, something with Kate Blanchett that my son would have found boring and my husband would have loved. My granddaughter called at exactly 8 o'clock and sang happy birthday off key, as she always did, and I sang back. My son texted at 9. My daughter called the next morning with what seemed like genuine embarrassment about the time difference she'd miscalculated, and we talked for 20 minutes about ordinary things, which felt actually like a kind of progress. I didn't set a table. I didn't make a roast. I didn't light the beeswax candles. I had a good evening. That was enough. That, I had finally learned, was the whole point. I still have the linen tablecloth. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe because throwing it out felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit, or maybe because it belonged to my mother and getting rid of it would have felt like losing her a second time. But it lives in a drawer now. I take it out when I want to, not because a date on the calendar tells me I should. That birthday, the 72nd, broke something open in me that I think had needed breaking for a long time. I'd spent years being the one who held things together, who set the table and kept the traditions, and made the occasions feel like occasions, the way my husband always had. And somewhere along the way, I'd confused that role with being needed, with mattering. When the table was set and nobody came, I had to sit with the question I'd been avoiding. Was I building a life, or was I maintaining a monument to a life that had already changed? What I've come to understand is that the choices we make and the choices other people make have a weight to them that accumulates quietly over time. My son didn't miss one birthday. He missed 4, in various ways, each time with a reason that made sense on its own and together formed a pattern I should have named sooner. My daughter read my message that night and didn't write back. Those weren't accidents. And my decision to sell the house, to sign that lease in Westboro, to sit with my lawyer and think clearly about what my life actually looked like, those weren't accidents either. Every action has a consequence, not as punishment, but as a simple and honest accounting. The life you tend is the life you get. What I admire most in my granddaughter, and I've thought about this a lot on those morning walks by the river, is that she is genuinely good in a way that has nothing to do with what she expects in return. She calls because she wants to talk. She mails cards with stamps. She asks, "What would help?" and waits for an actual answer. That kind of character doesn't appear from nowhere. It's built, slowly, through thousands of small decisions to pay attention to other people, to follow through, to keep your word even when something more convenient comes along. She has what I call a moral seriousness, a sense that how you treat people is not incidental to your life but is actually the whole point of it. I think about the person I was at 30, at 45, at 60, and I see a woman who was intelligent and capable and who poured that intelligence almost entirely into other people's needs. I managed a department, I supervised staff, I solved problems. But wisdom, the kind that tells you when to stop waiting, when a situation has revealed itself, when it's time to make a decision rather than absorb another disappointment, that came later and harder and mostly from pain. The courage it took to list that house, to make that phone call to my son, to have that honest conversation with my daughter. I don't want to overstate it, because I know other people face harder things. But it was real courage, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that just gets up the next morning and does the thing it decided to do. I had a good 73rd birthday. A really good one. And I think what made it good was not that everything was resolved, or that my family had transformed into the one I'd hoped for. It was that I had stopped organizing my happiness around other people's follow-through. I'd started showing up for my own life with the same care and attention I'd spent 4 decades showing up for everyone else's. That, I think, is what my husband would have wanted from me all along.